Looking back, I can't pinpoint the exact moment our marriage began to fall apart. Maybe it was gradual, like a thread unraveling over time, or maybe it was always there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be exposed. What I do know is that a single overheard phone call shattered the illusion of the life I thought we'd built together. I'm Jameson, 36 years old, a high school history teacher. My wife, Nora, is 34 and a project manager at a bustling tech company. We've been married for 10 years, a milestone that I used to be proud of. People would ask us for advice on making a relationship work, and I'd tell them it was all about trust, communication, and mutual respect. Now, I realize how hollow those words can sound when the foundation of your marriage starts to crack. On the surface, our relationship seemed solid. We had a comfortable routine, weekday dinners together, lazy Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper, and the occasional weekend getaway to keep things interesting. But looking back, I can see the signs, small, subtle changes that I ignored because I didn't want to believe anything was wrong. It started a few months ago. Nora became more distracted, more distant. She'd always been a hard worker, but now her job seemed to consume her. Late-night emails, impromptu, urgent calls, and weekends spent catching up on projects, it all felt like an excuse, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The real turning point came when she started stepping out to take phone calls, claiming they were work-related. At first, I didn't question it. But over time, her behavior became more secretive. She'd lower her voice when I walked into the room or quickly end the call if I got too close. And her phone, it was always in her hand or tucked away somewhere I couldn't see it, locked with a password I didn't know. I told myself I was imagining things. Nora had always been private, and I respected that. But the nagging feeling that something wasn't right wouldn't go away. It wasn't just the calls or the phone, it was the way she avoided eye contact when I asked about her day or how she'd shrug off my attempts to connect with her. The intimacy we once shared, the unspoken bond that made us feel like a team, was slipping away, and I didn't know how to bring it back. What I didn't realize then was that I wasn't imagining things. Something was wrong, and the truth was far worse than I could have anticipated. At first, I chalked up Nora's odd behavior to stress. Her job had always been demanding, and lately, she'd been dealing with a high-profile client that seemed to take up most of her time. She'd come home late, claiming she'd been stuck in meetings, or excuse herself during dinner to take urgent calls. It wasn't ideal, but I tried to be understanding. After all, I'd had my fair share of hectic weeks at school with parent conferences and lesson planning. But the excuses started piling up, and the little things began to add up in ways I couldn't ignore. She'd always been the type to leave her phone lying around the house, often forgetting where she'd placed it. Now, it was glued to her side. She'd take it with her everywhere, even into the bathroom, and it was always locked with a password I didn't know. If I asked who was calling or texting, she'd brush me off with vague answers, just work stuff or nothing important. It wasn't just her phone, though. Her demeanor had changed too. She was more withdrawn, her attention elsewhere even when we were in the same room. If I asked her a question, she'd give short, distracted responses, as though her mind was miles away. Our conversations, once easy and natural, now felt like pulling teeth. And intimacy? That had all but disappeared. She was always too tired or too busy. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her lips curling into a small smile, and quickly placed it face down on the coffee table. It was such a minor thing, but it stuck with me. Who was she smiling at? What could be so important that she couldn't share it with me? I tried to push the thought away, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed the moment over and over in my head. Nora was acting differently, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had nothing to do with work. The breaking point came a few nights later. Nora had stepped outside to take a phone call, something she'd started doing regularly. I didn't think much of it until I walked past the window and heard her voice. She was speaking in hushed tones, her words soft but unmistakable. "I miss you too," she said, her tone warm and affectionate in a way I hadn't heard in months. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. She paused, listening to the person on the other end, and then laughed, a light, melodic laugh that used to be reserved for me. My stomach turned as I stood there, straining to hear more. "Soon. I'll figure something out. I promise," she said before quickly ending the call. I moved away from the window just as she opened the door, pretending to be engrossed in my phone. "Who was that?" I asked casually, trying to keep my voice steady. "Work," she said quickly, avoiding my eyes. "Just a client needing some last-minute updates." I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. That wasn't a work call. I didn't know who she was talking to, but it was clear that their relationship was more than professional. That night, as Nora slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, consumed by doubt and suspicion. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd shared a decade of my life with, was hiding something, and I needed to find out what. The morning after overhearing Nora's phone call, I felt like I was living in someone else's life. The person lying next to me wasn't the Nora I thought I knew, the Nora I trusted, laughed with, and loved for the past decade. Her words from the night before played on a loop in my mind. "I miss you too. I promise." Who was she talking to? And what exactly had she promised? I couldn't let it go. The doubt gnawed at me like a splinter buried too deep to remove. At breakfast, I tried to act normal, but my mind was racing. Nora chatted about her day's meetings, her tone light and casual, as if everything was perfectly fine. It made me sick. How could she sit there, acting like nothing was wrong, after the conversation I'd overheard? That evening, I decided to start digging. Nora had gone to bed early, claiming she was exhausted from work. As I sat in the living room, staring at her phone on the charger, I felt a wave of hesitation. Snooping wasn't something I'd ever done before. We were supposed to trust each other, and crossing that line felt like betraying the very foundation of our marriage. But then again, hadn't she already betrayed me? I picked up her phone, my hands trembling, and tried to unlock it. No luck, it was password protected, as always. I set it back down, frustrated but determined. If I couldn't access her phone, I'd have to find another way. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to her behavior. I noticed how she always stepped outside or into another room to take calls, how she clutched her phone tightly whenever she wasn't using it, and how she seemed almost relieved when I didn't ask questions about her day. Each little detail felt like another piece of a puzzle I was beginning to put together. The turning point came one night when Nora left her laptop open on the kitchen table. She'd forgotten to close it before heading to bed, and I saw an email notification flash on the screen. My heart raced as I sat down and opened her email account, praying I wouldn't find anything, but secretly knowing I would. At first, everything looked normal. Work emails, reminders, and a few promotional newsletters cluttered her inbox. But then I noticed a folder labeled Personal. I clicked on it, my stomach churning, and immediately found what I'd been dreading. The emails were from someone named Elliot. They weren't explicit, but the tone was unmistakably intimate. In one message, he wrote, "Elliot. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. Let me know when we can talk again." My chest tightened as I read her response. "Nora. I feel the same way. Let's keep things simple for now, I don't want him to find out." I closed the laptop and sat back, my hands shaking. There it was, proof that she was having an affair. The woman I'd trusted with everything was lying to me, sneaking around behind my back with some guy named Elliot. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, leaving me in freefall. But even as my heart shattered, a darker part of me stirred. I wasn't just hurt, I was angry. Furious. If Nora thought she could humiliate me, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. After finding the emails, I couldn't stop replaying the words in my head. Let's keep things simple for now, I don't want him to find out. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. Nora wasn't just cheating, she was carefully managing the deceit, ensuring I remained oblivious while she carried on with Elliot. The woman I thought I knew had become a stranger, and I couldn't let this betrayal go unanswered. For the next few days, I played the role of the clueless husband. I greeted her with a smile when she came home, asked her about her day, and even offered to help with chores. Inside, I was simmering with rage, but I needed to bide my time, to gather more evidence. If I confronted her too soon, she might find a way to twist the truth, to make me doubt what I already knew. One evening, as she stepped outside to take yet another work call, I quietly followed. The back patio was poorly lit, and she hadn't closed the sliding door all the way. I stood just inside, out of sight, and listened. "I know," she was saying, her voice soft and intimate. "I miss you too. It's just hard, you know. I don't want to hurt him." She paused, presumably listening to Elliot's response, and then laughed quietly. It was a laugh I hadn't heard in months, a sound that used to be reserved for me. "Soon," she said. "I promise. I just need a little more time to figure things out." The conversation ended a few moments later, and I quickly moved away from the door, pretending to scroll on my phone when she came back inside. She gave me a quick smile and kissed me on the cheek, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to scream, to confront her right then and there, but I held back. Not yet. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The conversation I'd overheard confirmed everything. The affair wasn't just a fleeting mistake, it was an ongoing, calculated betrayal. She was stringing me along while planning her future with another man. The woman lying next to me in bed, the woman I'd loved and trusted for 10 years, was plotting against me. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I took another risk. Her phone was on the bathroom counter, and this time, it wasn't locked. My hands shook as I scrolled through her messages, searching for proof. It didn't take long to find it. Her texts with Elliot were every bit as damning as the emails. "Elliot. I hate not being able to see you as much as I want to. Can we meet tonight? Nora. I want to, but I don't think I can. He's been acting strange lately. I think he's suspicious." The nerve of her to acknowledge my suspicions while continuing her affair made my blood boil. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, my mind racing. There was no doubt now, Nora was living a double life. But what hit me hardest wasn't just the betrayal, it was the realization that she had no intention of stopping. This wasn't just a mistake she regretted. It was a choice she was actively making, over and over again. And I wasn't going to let it slide. As I stared at myself in the mirror, my jaw clenched and my fists balled, I made a decision: if she wanted to betray me, I would make sure she paid for it. Over the next few days, I struggled to keep my emotions in check. Every time I looked at Nora, I saw her lies, her deceit, and her complete disregard for the life we'd built together. The weight of it all pressed down on me, making it hard to think clearly. But beneath the pain, anger began to simmer, fueling a quiet determination. If she thought she could betray me and get away with it, she was sorely mistaken. At first, I considered confronting her outright. I envisioned throwing her texts and emails in her face, watching as the reality of her actions hit her. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that a confrontation would only give her a chance to twist the narrative. She'd cry, apologize, and try to manipulate me into believing her excuses. I wasn't going to give her that opportunity. Instead, I decided to play the long game. I would gather every piece of evidence I could, bide my time, and make sure that when I acted, she would have no room to deny or deflect. My mind raced with ideas, some rational, others fueled by my growing thirst for revenge. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair, it was about the humiliation, the lies, and the way she had made me question my own instincts. I started paying closer attention to her routine. She'd been meticulous about covering her tracks, but everyone slips up eventually. I watched her movements, noting when she stepped out for calls, when she left the house for work meetings, and how often she checked her phone. Every detail added to the picture I was building, a portrait of a woman living two lives. At the same time, I began to plan my response. If she wanted to destroy our marriage, I'd make sure she regretted every second of it. I started subtly preparing, setting aside important documents, researching our joint accounts, and even looking into lawyers. I wasn't going to let her blindside me if things escalated. But the hardest part was pretending everything was normal. Sitting across from her at dinner, listening to her talk about her day, felt like torture. Every smile, every laugh, every casual touch was a reminder of her betrayal. There were moments when I wanted to lash out, to throw my anger in her face and demand answers. But I forced myself to stay calm, knowing that my silence was the key to gaining the upper hand. One night, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I caught myself staring at her. She looked so composed, so comfortable, as if she had nothing to hide. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. How could she sit there, so at ease, when she was tearing our marriage apart behind my back? I clenched my fists and took a deep breath, reminding myself of the plan. My time would come. For now, I needed to stay patient, stay focused. If Nora thought she could play me for a fool, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The confrontation happened sooner than I had planned. My patience was wearing thin, and every passing day felt like a new layer of betrayal. But it wasn't just my emotions boiling over, it was Nora's increasing brazenness. The lies, the secrecy, and the stolen moments she thought I didn't notice all pushed me closer to the edge. One evening, after another one of her late-night calls on the patio, I couldn't hold back any longer. As she walked back inside, her face soft with a satisfied smile that made my stomach turn, I decided it was time. "Who was that?" I asked casually, my voice steady, though my hands were clenched tightly at my sides. Her smile faltered for a split second before she masked it with a shrug. "Work," she said, walking past me toward the kitchen. "Just catching up with a client." I followed her, leaning against the doorway as she poured herself a glass of water. "You sure about that?" I asked, my tone sharper now. She froze, the glass halfway to her lips. "What's that supposed to mean?" I stepped closer, my eyes locked on hers. "It means I know, Nora. I know about Elliot. I know about the calls, the emails, the affair. So, why don't you drop the act and tell me the truth for once?" Her face went pale, and for a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "Jameson, it's not what you think." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice rising. "Don't you dare try to twist this around. I've seen the messages. I heard the calls. You've been lying to me, sneaking around, and treating me like a fool. So don't stand there and insult my intelligence by pretending this is nothing." Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't move me. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice trembling. It got out of hand." "Got out of hand?" I repeated, my anger boiling over. "You mean sneaking around with another man, sending him messages, and making promises to him? That's what you call out of hand?" She put the glass down and pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking. "I was lonely, Jameson," she said through her tears. "You've been so distant lately, so wrapped up in work and your own world. I felt invisible, and Elliot, he made me feel seen." Her words hit me like a slap, but not for the reasons she intended. The sheer audacity of blaming me for her choices, of shifting the responsibility for her betrayal onto my supposed shortcomings, made my blood boil. "So, this is my fault?" I said, my voice dripping with incredulity. "You're saying I pushed you into his arms?" "That's not what I'm saying," she said quickly, shaking her head. I'm trying to explain how it happened." "Well, let me explain something to you," I said, stepping closer. "You didn't fall into an affair, Nora. You chose it. You chose to lie, to betray me, and to destroy everything we built together. So don't stand there and act like this is some tragic mistake. It's not. It's a choice you made every single day." She sobbed harder, her hands shaking as she reached for me, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said coldly. "I can't even look at you right now." The room fell silent except for her muffled cries. My chest heaved with the weight of everything I just unleashed, but instead of feeling relieved, I felt hollow. This was the woman I'd shared my life with, the person I thought I'd grow old with. And now, she was nothing more than a stranger who had ripped my heart out and stomped on it. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there with her guilt and her tears. As I shut the door to the guest room behind me, I realized this was only the beginning. The confrontation was over, but the war between us had just begun. After the confrontation, the house became a battleground of unspoken words and icy silences. Nora tried to mend things in her own way, making my favorite meals, asking about my day, and constantly apologizing. But her efforts felt hollow, like she was going through the motions without truly understanding the depth of what she'd done. I played along, nodding when she spoke, pretending to consider her apologies, but inside, I was seething. Her tears, her excuses, and her claims of loneliness didn't move me anymore. They only solidified my resolve to make her pay. I didn't want her apology or her guilt, I wanted her to feel the same anguish she'd inflicted on me. And so, I began to plan my revenge, methodically and quietly, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first step was subtle, I started gaslighting her. It was a small, almost petty thing at first. I'd move her belongings around when she wasn't looking, her keys, her phone charger, her work files. She'd grow frustrated, mumbling about how she could have sworn she left them in one spot. I'd shrug innocently, pretending I had no idea what she was talking about. When she tried to talk to me about our relationship, I'd give non-committal answers, leaving her uncertain about where we stood. I wanted her to feel as unsteady and confused as I had when I discovered her betrayal. Each small act chipped away at her confidence, and I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. But my revenge wasn't just about subtle mind games. I wanted her to experience the humiliation and heartbreak I'd felt, and I knew exactly how to make that happen. I started reconnecting with an old acquaintance, Lydia. She was someone I'd known years ago through mutual friends, a vibrant, intelligent woman who'd always had a flirtatious energy about her. I reached out under the guise of catching up, but my intentions were anything but innocent. Lydia and I started meeting for coffee, then dinner. At first, it was purely about setting the stage for Nora to find out. But as the weeks went on, I found myself genuinely enjoying Lydia's company. She was sharp, confident, and unashamedly bold, everything Nora had stopped being. It wasn't love, not even close, but it was a welcome distraction from the mess my life had become. I made sure Nora noticed the changes. I'd come home later than usual, claiming I'd been working late or meeting friends. I started dressing better, paying more attention to my appearance. She asked questions: where were you? Who were you with? And I answered just vaguely enough to keep her on edge. The moment I'd been waiting for came one Saturday afternoon. I left my phone on the kitchen counter, unlocked, and stepped out to run an errand. I'd made sure there was a string of text messages between Lydia and me open on the screen, messages that left no room for doubt about what was happening. When I returned, Nora was sitting at the table, her face pale and her hands trembling as she gripped my phone. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and betrayal. "What is this?" she demanded, holding up the phone. I shrugged, feigning indifference. "What does it look like?" Her voice cracked as she asked, "You're cheating on me." I crossed my arms, meeting her gaze with cold detachment. "Cheating? Is that what we're calling it now? Funny how that works, isn't it?" Her expression crumbled, and she broke into sobs, the sound raw and desperate. But I didn't feel pity. All I felt was satisfaction. She was finally beginning to understand what it felt like to have your world ripped apart. "Jameson, please," she begged through her tears. "You don't have to do this. We can fix this. I'll do anything." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided Elliot was worth more than your marriage," I said coldly, walking away as her sobs filled the room. It wasn't forgiveness I wanted, it was justice. And as far as I was concerned, this was only the beginning. After that day, the cracks in Nora's facade began to widen. The woman who had so carefully orchestrated her deceit now looked like a ghost of herself, pale, withdrawn, and unsure of every move she made. I could see the guilt and confusion eating away at her, and it should have made me feel triumphant. After all, wasn't this exactly what I wanted? But my satisfaction was fleeting. The anger still burned inside me, and her visible pain did little to extinguish it. If anything, it only fueled my desire to push things further. She had humiliated me, broken the trust we built over a decade, and turned our marriage into a farce. I wasn't going to let her off with just a taste of her own medicine. I wanted her to suffer, to feel the same level of betrayal and helplessness that I had. I continued my relationship with Lydia, making it impossible for Nora to ignore. I'd come home late, reeking of perfume that wasn't hers, or leave texts open on purpose, ensuring she saw every affectionate word Lydia sent me. Each discovery pushed Nora further into despair, and I reveled in the chaos. But it wasn't just about Lydia. I started subtly undermining her professionally as well. Nora prided herself on her career, so I began dropping hints to mutual acquaintances and colleagues that our marriage was struggling because of her poor choices. I didn't outright say she was having an affair, I let them piece that together themselves. The whispers quickly spread, and soon she was getting sideways glances and awkward silences in meetings. At home, our conversations became venomous. Whenever she tried to apologize or salvage what was left of our marriage, I'd throw her affair in her face, reminding her of every lie, every betrayal. "You think one apology is enough?" I snapped one night when she tried to talk about going to therapy together. "You didn't hesitate to destroy our marriage for Elliot, but now you're sorry because the consequences caught up to you?" Her tears, once a weapon that might have softened me, only deepened my resentment. "Jameson," she said, her voice breaking, "I'm trying to make this right. I've ended things with him. I want to fix us." I scoffed. "Ended things? Do you honestly think that erases what you've done? You can't undo the damage, Nora. You can't take back the lies or the betrayal." She broke down again, sobbing into her hands, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the emails, the phone calls, the stolen moments she thought I'd never notice, and the pity evaporated. The final blow came one evening when I invited Lydia over. Nora had gone to the store, and I made sure Lydia's car was parked prominently in the driveway. When Nora came home and saw it, her face went white. She stormed inside, trembling with rage and disbelief. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "She's here. In our house." I shrugged, feigning indifference. "Why not? It's not like this house is sacred anymore, is it?" Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. I wanted her to feel the humiliation I'd felt, to know what it was like to have your world ripped apart while the person you trusted most stood by and watched. "This is cruel," she whispered. "I know I hurt you, but this is heartless." Heartless? I said, my voice cold. No, Nora. Heartless is sneaking around with another man and expecting your husband to never find out. This is justice. As I walked past her toward the living room, I caught a glimpse of Lydia watching from the couch, her expression unreadable. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into my mind. Was this really justice, or was I just tearing us both apart piece by piece? But that doubt didn't stop me. I was too far gone, too consumed by the desire to make her pay. If Nora thought she could betray me without consequence, I was determined to prove her wrong, even if it meant destroying everything we had left. After that night, the fallout of my actions began to take shape. Nora's tears, her pleas, her anger, all of it became a regular occurrence in the house. The once warm atmosphere of our home had turned ice cold, a battleground where every glance carried the weight of unspoken accusations and seething resentment. Word of my affair with Lydia spread quickly, just as I'd intended. Mutual friends who had heard whispers from Nora now saw the evidence in my actions, and the narrative shifted. Nora had already been walking on eggshells socially after her own affair with Elliot came to light, but now the tables turned. People questioned her morality, her integrity, and even her ability to hold her life together. She brought it on herself, I told a coworker who asked about the situation, my voice calm and measured. She broke my trust first. I'm just trying to move forward. Of course, that wasn't the whole truth. I wasn't moving forward, I was spiraling further into bitterness and revenge. But no one needed to know that. Nora, however, wasn't coping as well. She withdrew from her friends, stopped attending social events, and even began to falter at work. A mutual friend told me she'd overheard a meeting where Nora was visibly shaken, her normally confident demeanor crumbling under the weight of everything she was dealing with. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated. I'd wanted her to feel the pain she inflicted on me, and now she was. But instead of satisfaction, I felt hollow. Every time I saw her in the house, her eyes red from crying, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected, guilt. It wasn't just her life that was unraveling. Mine was, too. Lydia and I continued to see each other, but our relationship felt strained. She'd been understanding at first, willing to play the role I needed her to, but lately, she'd been pulling back. One night, as we sat in her apartment after dinner, she turned to me with a look I couldn't quite read. "Jameson," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "what are we doing here?" "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "This," she said, gesturing between us. "I feel like I'm part of some game you're playing with Nora. And I didn't sign up for that." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't. She was right. Lydia had been a pawn in my revenge, a way to hurt Nora as deeply as she'd hurt me. And now, as the cracks in my own plan began to show, I realized how destructive this entire situation had become. When I returned home that night, I found Nora sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the wall. She didn't look up as I entered, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel anger toward her. "Are you happy now?" she asked softly, her voice hoarse. I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of my actions pressed down on me. I'd wanted to punish Nora, to make her pay for her betrayal. But in doing so, I'd turned into someone I barely recognized, a man consumed by anger, willing to destroy everything in his path for the sake of revenge. The fallout wasn't just hers anymore. It was ours. And neither of us was coming out of it unscathed. The days that followed were a mess of raw emotions and mounting consequences. My revenge, carefully plotted and executed, had spun wildly out of control. Nora barely spoke to me anymore, retreating into herself with every passing day. The house felt oppressive, suffused with tension so thick it was suffocating. Lydia ended things shortly after our conversation. "I can't do this," Jameson, she told me when I called to see if we could talk. You're too caught up in your anger, and I don't want to be part of whatever this is anymore. I should have felt something, regret, loss, even anger at her leaving, but instead, I felt nothing. Lydia had been a means to an end, and now that the end was here, her absence felt like one more piece of evidence in the pile of destruction I'd created. Nora's life was unraveling even faster. I heard through the grapevine that she'd been called into a meeting with her boss after her performance at work began to slip. Some of the colleagues who used to admire her now whispered behind her back, the rumors about her affair with Elliot spreading like wildfire. She came home one evening, her face pale and drawn, and headed straight to the bedroom without saying a word. For a moment, I considered following her, asking what had happened. But what could I say? That I was sorry. That I didn't mean for things to go this far. Even if those words were true, they felt meaningless in the face of everything I'd done. The final collapse came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Nora and I hadn't spoken in days, and the silence between us was unbearable. I decided to leave the house for a while, needing to get away from the suffocating atmosphere. As I grabbed my jacket, Nora appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Out," I said shortly, not in the mood for another argument. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Do you even care anymore?" Her question stopped me in my tracks. I turned to look at her, seeing the hollow, broken woman she'd become. "Do you?" I countered. She didn't answer, and the silence that followed felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. By the time I returned home that evening, she was gone. There was no note, no message, just the absence of her things from the closet and the bathroom. I stood in the bedroom, staring at the empty spaces where her belongings used to be, and for the first time, I felt the weight of everything I'd lost. She betrayed me first, yes. But my response, my calculated, vengeful response, had destroyed any chance we might have had to rebuild. And now, standing alone in the ruins of our life together, I wasn't sure if the revenge had been worth it. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the rain pounding against the windows, a single thought consumed me: we had both destroyed each other, and there was no going back. The house felt emptier than ever after Nora left. For days, I wandered from room to room, unable to escape the memories of what had once been. Every corner held a piece of our life together, a laugh we'd shared, a fight we'd worked through, a promise we'd made and broken. The silence was deafening, and for the first time, I had no one to blame but myself. Her departure should have felt like a victory. I had wanted to hurt her, to make her pay for what she'd done, and now she was gone, left to deal with the fallout of her choices. But instead of satisfaction, I felt hollow. The revenge that had once consumed me now felt like a Pyrrhic victory, one that had cost me more than I was willing to admit. Mutual friends reached out, but their conversations were shallow, laced with thinly veiled curiosity about the drama. "Are you doing okay?" they'd ask, their voices heavy with judgment. I could hear the rumors in their questions, the way they tiptoed around the details as if afraid I might lash out. I threw myself into work, hoping the structure of my routine would provide some solace. It didn't. Standing in front of a classroom of teenagers, trying to teach history while my own life felt like a cautionary tale, was exhausting. My co-workers noticed the change, offering polite concern, but I brushed them off. At night, the loneliness became unbearable. I replayed every decision I'd made, every bitter word I'd said to Nora, and wondered if there had ever been a way to salvage what we had. The realization that I might have pushed her further away, that my own actions had driven the final wedge between us, was a weight I couldn't shake. Then there was Lydia. Though I told myself her departure didn't matter, I missed her more than I cared to admit. Not because I loved her, what we'd had was never love, but because she had been a distraction, a way to drown out the pain. Now, without her, I was left alone with my regrets. Meanwhile, Nora's life seemed to be unraveling further. Through the few mutual friends we had left, I heard that she had taken a leave of absence from work. The rumors about her affair with Elliot had spread, and the once respected project manager was now the subject of office gossip. She'd moved into a small apartment across town, but no one seemed to know much else about how she was doing. Part of me wanted to reach out, to see if she was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I even say? That I regretted how things had turned out? That I was sorry for my part in the mess we'd made of our marriage? The words felt meaningless, empty in the face of everything we'd done to each other. As the weeks turned into months, I realized that neither of us had won. We were both broken, trapped in the wreckage of a life we'd once built together. Nora might have been the one to betray me first, but my revenge had ensured there was nothing left to save. And now, as I sat alone in the quiet of the house we'd shared, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd both been doomed from the start. Months passed, but the pain lingered like a wound that refused to heal. I'd hoped time might soften the edges of my anger, my regret, but instead, it only deepened the void inside me. The house was no longer a home, it was a monument to the life Nora and I had destroyed, brick by brick. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about her through mutual friends. She was struggling, financially, emotionally, socially. The reputation she'd worked so hard to build had crumbled, and she'd become a shadow of the confident, ambitious woman I'd once known. And yet, knowing this brought no comfort. I thought seeing her suffer would feel like justice, that it would validate everything I'd done. Instead, it left me feeling more empty and bitter than ever. I wasn't faring any better. My colleagues avoided me, their once friendly conversations now tinged with unease. My friends grew distant, unsure of how to navigate the wreckage of my life. Even my students seemed to sense something was wrong, their usual chatter replaced by awkward silences whenever I entered the room. I spent my evenings staring at the walls, replaying every moment that had led us here. Nora's betrayal, my revenge, the escalation of our mutual destruction, it all felt like a spiral we'd both been powerless to stop. I'd wanted to hurt her, and I had. But in doing so, I destroyed myself as well. One evening, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There we were, smiling at the beach on our honeymoon, laughing with friends at a barbecue, celebrating anniversaries and birthdays with genuine joy. It felt like a different life, one that belonged to someone else. How had we gotten here? How had love turned into something so toxic, so irreparable? The next day, I ran into one of our mutual friends at the grocery store. She looked uncomfortable, like she wanted to avoid me but couldn't find a polite way to leave. "How's Nora?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. She hesitated, then said, "She's hanging in there. She mentioned she's thinking about moving out of town. Starting over somewhere new." I nodded, unsure how to respond. The idea of her leaving felt like the final nail in the coffin of our shared history. Once she was gone, there would be nothing left to tie us together. When I got home, I sat in the empty living room, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I thought about calling her, reaching out to say something. But what would it change? Apologies wouldn't fix what we'd done. Closure was a myth, a word people used to pretend they could tie a neat bow around their pain. In the end, I didn't call. I didn't reach out. I let the silence stretch on, knowing it was all we had left. The truth was, there were no winners in this story. Nora and I had both lost, our marriage, our happiness, and any chance of redemption. We destroyed each other in ways we couldn't take back, leaving behind nothing but regret and emptiness. As I sat there, staring into the quiet void of the life we'd ruined, one thought consumed me: we'd had a chance at something beautiful, and we'd let it slip through our fingers. And now, all that remained was the wreckage of what could have been. There was no peace in the ending, no lessons learned, no hope for a brighter tomorrow. Just two broken people, each carrying the weight of their choices, destined to walk separate paths filled with nothing but regret.